kick this beggar out right now! My father's roar shattered the crystal-clinking silence of the yacht club like a physical blow, his face contorted in a mask of aristocratic madness. She's a stain, Ramsey. She doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as us. My mother shrieked, her elegance dissolving into pure, unadulterated venom. I stood there, frozen, blood-red wine dripping from my dress like a fresh wound, until the general manager did the impossible. He didn't seize me. He bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble floor. "Millie Ramsey," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying respect. "The Empire is yours. What is your command?" I blink, and for a split second the screaming fades into the rhythmic shush of the ocean, pulling me back 48 hours. Back to the moment the ground first began to shift beneath our feet. Before the yachts, before the lawsuits, and before I finally stopped being their victim, there was only the cold, looming shadow of the family home. The salt air of Newport always carries a scent of old money, and even older secrets. As I stepped onto the gravel driveway of the Ramsey estate, the crunch beneath my simple flats felt like bones snapping. I stood in the shadow of the towering stone pillars, my plain linen dress fluttering in the breeze. Around me, the 40th anniversary party of my father, Ramsey, was in full swing, a sea of silk, champagne, and laughter that didn't belong to me. Have you ever stood in a place you once called home and felt like a ghost haunting your own life? I looked up at the balcony, the place where I spent my childhood summers reading maritime ledgers while my sister, Borden, practiced her debutante walk. A house is built of bricks and mortar, but a home is built of belonging. Standing here, I realized I was standing on a property I had personally saved from foreclosure 3 years ago through a silent holding company. Yet I remained a stranger at the gate. My mind drifted back to the rainy afternoon of my 18th birthday. I remember the cold click of my father's fountain pen as he closed the ledger on my existence. "Borden is a fragile flower, Millie," he had said without looking up. "She requires the family's soil to bloom. You're the weed that can grow in the cracks of the sidewalk. You'll manage." Looking back now, I should have seen that moment for what it was. A liberation. I didn't feel the heat of anger then, nor do I now. Instead, a profound, stoic clarity settled over me. Forgiveness isn't about letting the person who hurt you off the hook. It's about untying the heavy rope they use to pull you down into their own darkness. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here to witness the end of an illusion. The music shifted to a lively jazz tempo as Borden was introduced under the garden spotlight. She was dripping in diamonds, the Ramsey Legacy collection. My throat tightened as I recognized the shimmer of the stones. I knew those jewels were only still in this family because of the maritime trust I had restructured in secret to keep my father's firms solvent. They were wearing my labor, my sweat, and my silence like a costume. "Millie? Is that you?" The voice was sharp, like a needle through silk. My mother, Meredith, approached me. She didn't offer a hug or a smile. Instead, she reached out with gloved fingers to adjust my plain collar, her face twisted in a look of practiced pity. "First impressions are the only currency we have left in Newport, Millie," she whispered, her eyes scanning the crowd to make sure no one saw her talking to the help. "And looking at you, it's clear you are utterly bankrupt." I didn't flinch. I reached into my small bag and pulled out an unmarked white envelope. I discreetly handed it to her assistant who was hovering nearby. Inside was a specialized medical voucher for the top heart specialist in Boston, a gift from my anonymous charitable foundation to cover the surgery Meredith claimed she couldn't afford. A person's character is best seen in how they treat those who can do nothing for them, I thought, watching her walk away. I had spent a decade performing the quiet labor that kept this stage standing, while my father bragged to Newport's elite about his self-made empire. I wonder, have you ever been the one holding up a roof for people who wouldn't even give you a seat at the table? The air grew heavy as Ramsey gathered the guests around the grand podium for the evening toast. The clinking of crystal died down, replaced by the rhythmic shush of the Atlantic waves against the cliffs below. He stood tall, his silver hair catching the light, projecting the image of the invincible patriarch. "Tonight is about the future," Ramsey announced, his voice booming with a false confidence that only I could see through. "It is about the Ramsey legacy, and the one child who truly understood the weight of this family name. He beckoned Borden to the stage. The crowd erupted in applause as he named her the sole heir to the Ramsey holdings, effectively erasing my name from the family's history in front of every power player in Rhode Island. I stood barely 3 feet from the podium, yet his eyes swept over me as if I were a piece of patio furniture. Unseen, uncounted, irrelevant. The last thread of filial duty I had been clinging to didn't just break. It evaporated. Honor cannot be given to those who have no integrity, and love cannot be forced upon those who only value mirrors. I felt a strange shift inside me, a sudden lightness. You cannot lose what you never truly had, and in that moment, I finally shed the crushing burden of their expectations. My phone vibrated in my palm. I looked down at the glowing screen. A text from Killian at the Yacht Club appeared. "The transfer is complete, Millie. You now hold the keys to the Atlantic legacy. What is your first move?" I tucked the phone away and looked at the family I no longer called my own. They were toasting to a future that had already changed, and they didn't even hear the locks turning. The drive from the estate to the Atlantic Legacy Yacht Club was a blur of Newport's coastal beauty, but the air inside my car felt heavy, charged with a strange, electric anticipation. I arrived an hour after the anniversary toast, the high noon sun beating down on the white decks and crystal glassware of the club with a blistering intensity. Stepping onto the terrace, I felt the oppressive weight of the elite atmosphere. My family was already there, huddled at a central table, shamelessly performing for a group of billionaire investors. Ramsey was in the middle of a desperate pitch, his hands moving with a frantic energy as he tried to sell a high-risk venture to mask the family's crumbling finances. I stood near the railing, watching the charade. I carried myself with a quiet grace that didn't require a designer label or a diamond-encrusted watch. I've always believed that true nobility is being superior to your previous self, not your fellow man. My linen dress was slightly wrinkled from the drive, a sharp contrast to the armored perfection of the Ramsey women. Ramsey noticed me almost immediately. I saw the flash of irritation in his eyes. To him, my plain presence was a visual threat to the image of success he was working so hard to fabricate. Near the service entrance, a young server was struggling with a heavy tray of appetizers. His hands were shaking slightly under the heat and the pressure of the demanding crowd. I stepped in quietly, placing a steadying hand on the edge of the tray and offering him a small, encouraging smile. "You've got this," I whispered. He breathed a sigh of relief and moved on. I watched him go, thinking that a person's character is most clearly seen in how they treat those who can do absolutely nothing for them. Have you ever noticed how the loudest people in the room are often the ones with the least to say about kindness? While my family was busy performing for the powerful, I was simply trying to be present for the people. The tension broke when Ramsey's pitch faltered. One of the investors glanced my way, his brow furrowed as he tried to place me in the social hierarchy of the deck. Ramsey snapped. It wasn't just a request for me to leave, it was a public execution. He shouted across the terrace, his voice amplified by the saltwater breeze. "Security! Kick this beggar out right now! This club is a sanctuary for excellence, not a shelter for the shiftless." The deck went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic slapping of waves against the hull of the super yachts. Meredith didn't try to soften the blow. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood like a judge's gavel. "She doesn't deserve to be here, Ramsey." "She never did," she said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "Millie, you're nothing but a stain on the Newport sun. Please just disappear." I stood perfectly still, my heart steady. I realized in that moment that their words were a reflection of their own internal poverty, not my worth. Silence is a choice, not a weakness. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent, and I was no longer giving them mine. I wonder, what would you have done if your own mother called you a stain in front of the world? Borden saw the investors watching me, their expressions shifting from confusion to a strange kind of curiosity at my lack of reaction. She decided to trash the threat. She stood up, a glass of vintage Cabernet in her hand, and began to walk toward me with a faux clumsiness that wouldn't have fooled a child. She tripped right in front of me, drenching the front of my light linen dress in a deep, blood-red wine. The liquid felt cold and heavy against my skin. Oops! Borden smirked, her voice a cruel stage whisper that carried perfectly to the nearby tables. Now you look exactly like the mess you are. Go home, Millie, and wash off the failure. You're embarrassing us. I looked down at the dark stains spreading across my chest. Instead of lashing out or bursting into tears, I slowly removed my blazer. Beneath it, hanging from a simple chain, was a tarnished silver locket, the only thing my grandmother had left me before she passed. I wiped a stray drop of wine off the silver with a white napkin, my movements slow and deliberate. Stains on fabric can be washed, Borden, I said, my voice calm and unwavering. But stains on a soul are permanent. I hope you eventually find the peace you're so desperately trying to drown me in. The crowd murmured, the investors looking between us with newfound scrutiny. Ramsey signaled the security guards who moved in to seize my arms. I didn't resist, but I didn't look down. I held my head high, ready to walk out of their world forever. The guards were inches away when a voice boomed from the club entrance, stopping them mid-stride. Unhand her. Now! Or you'll all be looking for new jobs by sunset. Killian stepped onto the terrace, his eyes fixed on me with a fierce loyalty that made the Ramseys recoil. As the red wine seeped into my skin, I felt the old Millie dying, and the new owner of the Atlantic legacy taking her first breath. The cold, recycled air of the VIP lounge smelled of expensive leather, stale cigar smoke, and a desperate, suffocating ambition. Killian had cleared the terrace, but the Ramseys had practically dragged me into this wood-paneled sanctum, away from the prying eyes of Newport's elite. I sat in a high-backed armchair, my back as straight as a spear, despite the red Cabernet soaking into my skin. I remember my grandfather once telling me that character is like a tree, and reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it, but the tree is the real thing. My family had spent their entire lives chasing the shadow, and now they were finally realizing the tree they stood under was hollow and dying. Ramsey paced the room, his silver hair disheveled, the mask of the invincible patriarch finally slipping. He dropped the pretense of the successful businessman and laid the wreckage of the Ramsey empire bare. Their commercial real estate holdings were a house of cards, facing a $12 million margin call that would be triggered by sunrise. I listened in silence, a heavy melancholia settling over my heart. They had no idea that for the past 3 years I had been the anonymous angel investor paying their property taxes and covering Meredith's $200,000 oncology bills through a shielded LLC. I didn't do it for their gratitude. I did it because my integrity isn't dependent on their cruelty. Have you ever carried the weight of a family that didn't even know you were the only thing keeping them from the ground? Millie, you have to listen to me, Ramsey said, his voice dropping to a low, coercive rumble. He shoved a thick legal folder onto the mahogany table. He demanded that I sign over my little shipping consultancy. The business he believed was just a small desk job, so he could use its clean credit line to secure a predatory loan. He viewed my decade of hard work as a crop he was entitled to harvest, simply because he had given me life. Looking back now, I realize that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones told by strangers, but the ones we tell ourselves about the people who share our blood. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Meredith, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly began to gasp for air. Her hand clutched her chest in a practiced, theatrical display of heart failure. "Oh God, she's having an attack!" Borden screamed, rushing to her side with a dramatic flourish intended to bypass my logical defenses and trigger my guilt. I watched them, my eyes sharp and analytical. I noticed Meredith's pulse point in her neck was steady, and her skin lacked the telltale clammy pallor of a true cardiac event. It was an ambush of the heart, a high-stakes emotional kidnapping designed to force my hand. Borden hissed at me, her face contorted with a false fury. "Your stubbornness is killing her, Millie. Do you want her blood on your hands, too? Just sign the papers and end this." They were using the most sacred American value, family loyalty, as a blunt instrument to bludgeon me into submission. It was a classic move, the kind of gaslighting that makes you wonder if you're the monster for wanting to keep what you've built. I sat there, feeling the final embers of my hope for a real family turning to ash. I realized then that you cannot save people who view your survival as an obstacle to their luxury. I slowly reached for the heavy silver pen on the table. For a split second, my hand trembled. It wasn't fear, it was the sheer crushing weight of the disappointment I felt for the woman who raised me. I looked Meredith directly in the eyes. Eyes that were supposedly clouded by pain, but were actually darting toward the legal folder with a hungry intensity. "Is this truly what your love costs, Mother?" I asked, my voice a whisper that seemed to chill the room. A signature for a lie? Are we so bankrupt of truth that we have to stage a tragedy just to pay a debt? Meredith's breathing hitched, but she didn't stop the act. Ramsey leaned over me, the scent of expensive scotch and desperation radiating from his suit. "Sign it, Millie, for the family." I didn't sign. Instead, I pulled my tablet from my bag and laid it on the mahogany table. A real-time notification from the club's medical response team flashed on the screen. I had secretly alerted them the moment we entered the room. "I've already called a specialized private ambulance," I said calmly. "The one I pay for through my foundation. They'll be here in 3 minutes to take you to a clinic I own in Boston. They have the most advanced cardiac diagnostic equipment in the country." The reaction was instantaneous and revealing. Meredith's symptoms vanished as if by magic. She sat up straight, the labored breathing replaced by a sharp, panicked realization. She knew that professional medical scrutiny would expose her fraud within minutes. The air in the room turned frigid as their altar of sacrifice was exposed for what it was. A stage for a cheap scam. I felt a profound sense of release, the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally see the bottom of a well. I stood up, the wine-stained dress now looking less like a mark of shame and more like a warrior's cloak. I looked at the legal folder, then at the 3 people who had spent their lives trying to make me feel small so they could feel grand. "You didn't want my help," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You wanted my life. You wanted to strip me of everything I earned so you could continue to pretend you are something you're not. From this moment on, you'll have to learn to survive on your own. I'm done being the ghost that pays your bills." Ramsey tried to speak, to reach for me, but his hand stopped midair. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the weed in the cracks, but as the force that had been holding up his sky. Borden's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, but behind it, I saw the first flicker of genuine fear. They had played their strongest card, the card of guilt, and I had called their bluff with the truth. I think it's a universal truth that the people who complain the most about your boundaries are the ones who benefited most from you having none. As I turned to leave, the heavy double doors of the VIP lounge swung open. Killian was standing there, his silhouette framed by the bright light of the lobby. He wasn't holding a tray or a towel. He was holding a black leather portfolio embossed with the gold seal of the Newport ownership group. He didn't look at the Ramseys. His eyes were only on me, waiting for the command he knew was coming. As the doors swung open, I saw Killian standing there, not as a manager, but as the herald of my true kingdom. I walked out of the VIP lounge and back into the main lobby, the wine stain on my dress now a dark, dry seal of the betrayal I had just survived. Ramsey followed me like a shadow, his voice a frantic rasp of threats and desperate demands. He was still shouting about disowning me, about calling the Newport police for my fraudulent refusal to sign his predatory documents, his face a mottled mask of aristocratic rage. Around us, the elite guests and club security lingered, their whispers a low hum against the marble floors. I didn't look back at him. I simply walked toward the light of the terrace, realizing that power isn't something people give you. It is something you realize you've had all along. I had spent 10 years building a real empire, while they spent 40 years polishing a hollow shell. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, shifting shadows across the lobby as the sound of the ocean waves intensified into a steady, rhythmic roar. From the administrative wing, Killian appeared. He didn't walk. He moved with the precision of a man who knew the tides had finally turned. He was flanked by 2 legal couriers in sharp, charcoal suits, their briefcases glinting under the crystal chandeliers. Ramsey saw him and pointed a shaking finger at me, barking orders to have me dragged off the premises for disturbing the peace. Killian didn't even acknowledge the noise. He walked straight toward me, his eyes locked on mine with a focus that silenced every other person in the room. In that moment, I thought about the weight of gold versus the weight of truth. Looking back now, I realize that truth is the only currency that doesn't devalue when the world catches fire. Then, the moment of impact arrived, the kind of cinematic shift that changes a story forever. Killian stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He clicked his heels with military precision and performed a deep, 90-degree bow. It was a gesture of absolute unwavering fealty, a ritual Newport hadn't seen in decades. The lobby went bone-chillingly silent. You could hear the distant clink of a silver spoon on the terrace. But here, in the heart of the Atlantic legacy, the air had simply stopped moving. Killian stayed in that bow for 5 long seconds, long enough for the reality to sink into the marrow of every witness present. "Ma'am," Killian's voice echoed through the marble hall, steady and resonant. "The final audits are complete. The Atlantic legacy is now officially under your direct command. The board has been notified and the deed is recorded. What are your orders regarding these guests?" The shock in the room was a physical force. Ramsey's face drained of color, going from a furious red to a deathly, chalky gray as he gripped the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. Meredith's hand dropped from her chest as she completely forgot to continue her fainting spell, her eyes widening in a terror that was finally genuine. Beside them, Borden's champagne glass slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the polished floor, a symbolic end to her status as the family's perfect jewel. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply looked at the shards of glass at Borden's feet, and then up at the sister who had just tried to drown my dignity in red wine. I felt a strange, detached sense of grace. "I once told you that glass can be replaced, Borden," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent lobby. "But trust is like a diamond. Once it's cracked, the flaw remains forever. I'm truly sorry you chose the crack over the bond we could have had." I meant it. The tragedy wasn't my victory. The tragedy was the years of love they had traded for a vanity that was currently evaporating. I wonder, have you ever realized that the person you were trying to impress was actually the one holding the keys to your survival? Killian handed me the heavy black leather portfolio, its gold seal catching the afternoon light. In the United States, maritime property transfers through a holding company are absolute the moment the documents are filed. I was no longer a disappointing daughter or a guest of the Ramsey name. I was the landlord. I was the sovereign of the very ground they stood on. Ramsey tried one final pathetic play, his voice cracking with a desperate arrogance. "This is my club. I've been a member for 30 years. You can't just take this." I looked at him, the wine stain on my linen dress serving as a silent testament to the baptism he and Borden had just forced upon me. He was still trying to use his status as a shield, not realizing the shield had been sold months ago. "Killian," I said, my voice quiet but carrying more weight than Ramsey's loudest shouts. "Revoke the Ramsey family membership effective immediately. Reference Clause 12.4, Conduct unbecoming of a member. They have humiliated this institution, the staff, and themselves in front of our investors." The words were a legal guillotine. Without club membership, Ramsey's board positions across Newport would crumble like wet sand. His entire social identity was tied to this terrace, and I was cutting the anchor. As the security team, men who had known Ramsey for years but now answered only to me, moved forward to escort them out, I saw the absolute ruin in my father's eyes. But I couldn't just let them walk out into the dark without one last gesture of the girl I used to be. I stopped the guards for a second. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small professional card. I stepped toward Ramsey, who was now trembling with a mix of shock and unadulterated hatred. I tucked the card into his breast pocket. "I don't want your ruin, Father," I said softly, looking him in the eye. "I just want my peace. That's the contact for a financial advisor specialized in graceful downsizing. Use it to save what's left of your home and your soul." It was the last act of kindness Millie Ramsey would ever offer them. They were led toward the grand exit in front of all their peers, their heads bowed in a public shaming they had earned with every lie they ever told me. But just as they reached the heavy oak doors, Ramsey turned back. The grief in his eyes had been replaced by a new, dangerous light, the look of a man who would rather burn the world down than lose his crown. "You think you've won, Millie?" he spat, his voice trembling with a toxic venom. "You've just started a war. I'll see you in court for elder abandonment and fraud before the sun sets tonight. You'll find out that in this country, blood is thicker than any deed you can buy." I stood in the center of the lobby, the portfolio heavy in my hand, watching them disappear into the Newport fog. The silence that followed their departure felt like a prayer, a moment of stillness I had waited 10 years to earn. But deep down, I knew Ramsey wasn't bluffing. The storm wasn't over. It was just moving from the docks to the courthouse. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of victory was merely the eye of the hurricane. I looked at Killian, who stood ready for the next move. "Prepare the legal team," I whispered, "and find out exactly how much debt they've hidden in Borden's name. If he wants a war of blood, I'll give him a war of ledger." The silence that followed the family's expulsion from the yacht club was short-lived, a mere breath of calm before the Newport fog swallowed the last of my patience. 48 hours later, the storm I had predicted made landfall in the form of a thick, blue legal folder delivered to my private office. I sat in my renovated Victorian, the scent of aged oak and fresh ink grounding me as I read the words that felt like a deliberate serrated edge against my heart. Ramsey and Meredith weren't just angry. They were weaponizing the legal system to dismantle my life. The lawsuit was a masterclass in psychological warfare, alleging elder abandonment and constructive fraud. They claimed I had used my maritime consultancy as a front to siphon off their retirement funds, painting me as a predator who had spent a decade in the shadows plotting their ruin. I stood by the window, watching the rain begin to lash against the glass, the Newport sky turning a bruised purple. On the small television in the corner, a local news segment aired. There was Ramsey, looking frail and hollowed out, wearing an old sweater that made him appear smaller, more vulnerable. Beside him, Borden was a vision of tragic sisterhood, dabbing at her eyes as they characterized my plain lifestyle and 10-year absence as the calculated cover of a criminal mastermind. It was a staggering betrayal, a total inversion of the truth. Integrity has no need for a spotlight. It shines brightest when the shadows are darkest. I watched their performance with a steady hand, refusing to fire back with the same venom. I knew that in this country, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. But I was done running. The pressure intensified as the evening turned into a stormy night, the wind howling through the historic eaves of my home. Killian arrived shortly after the broadcast, his coat damp, his expression grimmer than I had ever seen it. He dropped a stack of preliminary discovery documents onto my desk. Ramsey hadn't just lied to the cameras. He had fabricated a trail of forged checks, supposedly showing me withdrawing massive sums from Meredith's medical trust over the years. It was a parental trap of the highest order. The lawsuit wasn't actually about the money. They knew I had it. It was designed to trigger the moral turpitude clause in the Newport Legacy Group's bylaws. If I were found guilty of elder abuse, the board would be legally obligated to force me to vacate my ownership. I leaned back in my chair, a profound sense of pity washing over me. "They are trying to drown me in the very ocean I pulled them out of for a decade, Killian," I whispered. It felt as if every breath I had taken to keep them afloat was being used to choke me. I realized then that my father's arrogance wasn't just a character flaw. It was a survival mechanism for a man who couldn't bear the thought of being beholden to the daughter he had deemed worthless. I recalled the old American proverb, "Don't mistake my kindness for weakness." They thought because I had served them in silence, I was a servant. They were about to learn that a debt master doesn't need to shout to be heard. The preliminary hearing was held the following morning in a closed chamber at the Newport courthouse. The air inside was sterile, smelling of floor wax and the cold weight of the law. Ramsey's lawyer, a man with a smile as sharp as a razor, smugly presented the evidence of my supposed theft. He spoke of filial duty and the sacred bond I had allegedly shattered for profit. Ramsey sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the floor, still playing the part of the broken father. I stood up, not as a defendant trembling before an accusation, but as the woman who held every string of their remaining lives. I felt Millie Ramsey, the girl who was once a weed in the cracks, finally stepping into the full, burning light of her own power. "Your Honor," my lead counsel began, his voice cutting through the lawyer's theatrics. "We are not here to defend against a theft. We are here to settle a debt." He laid out a certified document we called the Ledger of Hidden Solvency. The room went bone-chillingly still as the evidence was presented. It proved, through ironclad bank records and IRS filings, that the medical trust Ramsey claimed I robbed was actually funded 100% by my own anonymous shell company. I had been the one providing the blood for their veins, while they were busy plotting to cut my throat. I stepped forward, making eye contact with Ramsey for the first time since the yacht club. "You sued me for abandonment, Father," I said, my voice steady, echoing with a quiet authority that silenced the room. "But the truth is, I've been the only one holding you up. I didn't steal your past. I bought your future so you wouldn't end up on the street. I purchased the underlying mortgages on the family estate and your failing firms months ago. You aren't suing a thief. You are suing your landlord." The shock was a physical presence in the room. Ramsey's lawyer froze, his smug smile evaporating as he looked at the documents that turned his entire case into a confession of his client's insolvency. I felt a surge of deep empowerment, a realization that the truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. I didn't want their ruin, but I was done protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. "If you want a war of blood," I continued, "you'll find that a debt master doesn't need to shout. I have been your silent guardian for 10 years, but that silence ends today." For a moment, I saw the man behind the mask, the small, terrified boy who had realized he had lost everything because he couldn't love what he didn't control. Have you ever seen a person's entire world collapse just because they finally had to face the mirror? Borden, sensing the total collapse of their narrative, leaned over and whispered something frantically into Ramsey's ear. Her face was pale, her composure finally shattered. Ramsey's lawyer suddenly straightened his tie, a desperate, predatory glint returning to his eyes. He pulled a hidden digital recorder from his briefcase and laid it on the judge's bench. "That's a very moving speech, Millie," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with a new kind of malice. "But Newport might feel differently when they hear the recording of you threatening to let your mother die in that VIP lounge. Let's see how the board feels about a daughter who holds her mother's life hostage for a signature." The courtroom went silent as the distorted audio began to play, my own voice sounding cold and detached through the small speaker. I realized in that heartbeat that they were willing to burn everything down, the club, the family name, and their own remaining dignity, just to see me in ashes. I didn't realize it then, but the war of ledgers was about to become a war of souls. I looked at Killian, who was already reaching for his phone, and I knew the next few hours would define whether I was a survivor or just another Ramsey casualty. The air in the high-tech legal conference room was sterile, tasting of ozone and filtered perfection, a sharp contrast to the torrential Newport storm visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Lightning fractured the sky, momentarily illuminating the strained faces of the Ramsey family across the mahogany table. I've always believed that a half-truth is the most cowardly form of a lie, and Ramsey was currently betting his entire future on a spliced recording. Have you ever noticed how people who are drowning in their own deceit will try to pull you down just to use you as a stepping stone? Ramsey's lawyer looked at me with a predatory grin, convinced that he had finally trapped the invisible daughter. But Killian didn't even blink. He signaled for the couriers to connect a secured drive to the room's digital display. While the Ramseys had a grainy audio clip, I had the truth in 4K resolution. I had installed high-definition security surveillance in the club's private lounges for asset protection months ago, long before I knew they would try to ambush me there. The video began to play, showing the full, unedited sequence. The calm pulse in Meredith's neck, the way she winked at Borden when they thought I wasn't looking, and the instant, miraculous recovery of her symptoms the second I mentioned professional medical scrutiny. Looking back now, I realize that you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool the digital paper trail of a woman who has nothing left to lose but her dignity. The judge's eyes shifted from the screen to Ramsey, the skepticism in the room becoming a palpable, freezing weight. The medical gaslighting was stripped bare, exposed as a desperate attempt at extortion. In this country, the law respects evidence, but it has a special kind of disdain for those who weaponize a mother's health to settle a financial grudge. I felt a cold disappointment settle in my chest, not for the loss of their love, but for the confirmation that they never intended to offer any. Then, the final mask fell away, and the smoke and mirrors that had defined the Ramsey name for 40 years shattered on the sterile floor. Ramsey, cornered by the financial ledgers proving I had been their secret benefactor, finally snapped. The aristocratic facade crumbled into a raw, toxic rage. On the legal record, he shouted that they had never intended to reconcile at that brunch. They had invited me to groom me, to turn me into the fall guy for a multi-million-dollar tax evasion scheme they had committed in Borden's name. He stood up, his fingers shaking as he pointed at me, screaming that I was always meant to be the shield for Borden's shining future because one child was born to lead and the other was born to serve. The admission of my disposability echoed through the glass-walled room like a gunshot. Borden looked away, her silence a confession of her complicity. I sat there, absorbing the shocking betrayal of a father who viewed his youngest child as a sacrificial lamb for his favorite. I didn't strike back with anger. I didn't shout. I simply looked at the man who had helped give me life and felt a profound, quiet pity. I used to think I was the disappointment of this family, Ramsey, I said, my voice barely above a whisper but silencing his rage. Now I realize I was the only part of it that was actually real. I don't hate you for choosing Borden. I pity you for never taking the time to know me. In that moment of absolute victory, I chose a different path than the one they had laid for me. I looked at the judge and informed the court that, despite his confession, I was establishing a permanent, non-revocable trust for Ramsey's healthcare. I would pay for a private rehabilitation center to handle his mounting stress-induced issues, but under one condition: he was never to contact me again. I've always held on to the belief that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it so that when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a reflection of his cruelty. I wonder, would you have the strength to save someone who spent their life trying to destroy you? But the final blow, the twist that truly cut the last anchor of my past, was yet to come. During the court-ordered asset inventory of Meredith's personal safe, Killian produced a small velvet box. Inside lay the tarnished silver and diamond locket, the one I had been told was lost, the only piece of my grandmother I had left. Meredith had hidden it years ago to claim insurance fraud, letting me believe for a decade that I had been careless with the only thing I truly cherished. She had sat through my tears, watched my grief, and kept the jewel for a few $1,000s in insurance money. The realization of the void was absolute. This wasn't just neglect. It was a psychological dismantling of a child's heart for a profit margin. The final thread of filial love I had been holding onto snapped with a quiet, hollow sound. I stared at the locket, realizing that the people I called family had already decided I was a stranger long before I ever left Newport. I didn't cry. I simply took the locket, rubbed the silver clean with my thumb, and signed the restraining and non-disparagement agreement. I settled their remaining debts one last time, effectively buying their silence and their permanent absence from my life. I was finally, legally, and emotionally unattached to the Ramsey name. That moment changed everything for me. I walked out of the courthouse as the rain finally tapered off, the heavy Newport clouds parting to reveal a pale, cold moon. The air felt lighter, as if the gravity of 40 years of lies had finally been lifted. Killian met me on the stone steps, his expression one of quiet respect. He didn't offer a celebratory drink. He handed me a set of heavy brass keys to a vessel I hadn't seen yet. "The Alethea is docked at Pier 1, Millie," he said softly. "The tide is coming in, and your new life is waiting." Standing on the courthouse steps, I felt the weight of 10 years of lies fall away like rusted chains, leaving me with nothing but the truth and the open sea. The salt air filled my lungs, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel like the Ramsey disappointment. I felt like the master of my own horizon. The world didn't end with a bang or a frantic courtroom battle. It ended with a quiet meeting on the terrace of the Atlantic Legacy, the very place where they once tried to erase me. I sat across from the family's legal representative, the golden Newport sunset casting long, warm shadows over the table. My movements were deliberate and firm as I signed the final family separation agreement. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was providing them with a spendthrift trust, a safety net that ensured Ramsey and Meredith would have a modest home and proper medical care, but absolutely zero access to my corporate empire or this club. I looked out at the water and reflected on the American principle of self-reliance that had carried me through the last decade. I am providing for your needs, not your greed, I told the lawyer, my voice calm and detached. I am doing this because of who I am and the values I hold, not because of what they did to me. It's a hard lesson to learn, but I've come to understand that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. By providing this trust, I wasn't just being kind. I was effectively closing the door on their ability to ever play the victim again. Under the law, I had fulfilled every ounce of filial responsibility, making future lawsuits impossible. I wasn't paying them off. I was buying my permanent freedom. Looking back now, I realized that silence is the ultimate closing argument. As the sun began to dip below the Newport horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange, the final act of the Ramsey drama unfolded. Killian stood nearby, oversight personified, as security professionals quietly escorted Ramsey, Meredith, and Borden toward the grand gates of the club for the final time. The elite members of Newport, the people my father had spent his life trying to impress, watched in a heavy, respectful silence. They weren't just witnessing a departure, they were acknowledging the arrival of a new era of leadership. I watched from the terrace, not with joy or a sense of winning, but with the quiet solemnity of someone finally burying a ghost. Borden, ever the performer, tried to make one last scene near the exit, her voice rising in a shrill, desperate plea for attention. I stepped down from the terrace and walked toward her. I didn't say a word until I was inches away. I reached into my pocket and handed her a small sealed envelope containing the silver locket we had recovered from Meredith's safe. "This belongs to the memory of our grandmother Borden," I said softly, my voice cutting through her hysterics. "I hope looking at it reminds you that value isn't found in what you wear, but in the truth you tell." She went silent, the weight of the silver in her hand seemingly heavier than all the diamonds she had ever worn. Value is a choice, and she had finally run out of things to trade. I turned my gaze to Ramsey. He was looking at the white pillars and the manicured greens of the club he once thought he owned. In that moment, the realization seemed to settle into his bones. He had merely been a tenant in his daughter's brilliance, a man who mistook the shadow for the tree. I didn't feel the need to say goodbye. I shared a final thought with Killian as they were led through the gates. "A bird is never afraid of the branch breaking, Killian," I whispered, "because her trust is not in the branch, but in her own wings." He nodded, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, how long I had been preparing for this flight. The transition from the high-tension storm to this calm was almost overwhelming. I walked away from the gates and toward Pier 1, where the super yacht Alethea was waiting for the tide. The name means truth, and as I boarded, I felt the final layers of the Ramsey name falling away from my skin like old, dead leaves. I went below deck and changed out of my wine-stained blazer, the one that had seen me through the baptism of their contempt, and into a fresh, simple outfit. Standing on the deck as the engines hummed to life, I felt a deep, resonant liberation. We were heading into the vast, open Atlantic, leaving the pettiness of Newport behind. Killian joined me at the railing as the yacht pulled away from the docks. He didn't bring more legal papers. He brought a new mission statement for the Newport Legacy Group. It was the blueprint for a foundation I was establishing, one focused on supporting erased children, the ones the world deemed not worth the investment. We were going to provide the soil for the weeds that grow in the cracks, ensuring they had the light they deserved. It was the ultimate way to honor the struggle that had made me who I am. I realized then that I didn't just win a property. I finally won back my soul. They didn't just lose a club. They lost the only person who would have loved them for absolutely nothing. The shoreline of my past began to shrink into a thin, dark line against the moonlit water. I felt a quiet power settling in my chest, a strength that didn't need to shout to be felt. Many of you listening today have carried the weight of a family that didn't see your worth. You've been the other daughter, the one left out of the photos, the one whose achievements were whispered while others' failures were shouted. I want to know, what was the moment you finally chose yourself? What was the moment you realized your value wasn't something they could grant or take away? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one of them, because I know how much it matters to finally be heard. The Alethea hit the open water, the rhythmic thud of the hull against the waves, a steady heartbeat in the dark. My phone, which had been silent for hours, suddenly pinged with a single notification. I pulled it out, expecting another desperate plea or a legal threat. Instead, it was an unread message from an unknown number. I opened it, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The message read, "You think the Ramsey debt is settled, Millie? You've only scratched the surface of what your father truly owes. Look into the 1998 maritime logs for the Star of Newport." I looked back at the receding lights of the coast, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The debt wasn't just financial, it was historical. I felt a new chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. I didn't realize it then, but the quiet shore was just a stopping point. The master of her own horizon was about to find out that some secrets are buried too deep for even the tide to wash away. I gripped the railing, my knuckles white, and gave the order to head deeper into the dark.